When women of the Langhorn family disappeared, no one asked questions. They were not searched for. They were not remembered. And 9 months later, in the house of the old pastor, boys with identical eyes were born. In the Austin County archives, a letter from 1924 was found. They come for the women when the moon is waning. No one returns. The boys remain, and they are all the same. She lived alone in the weathered house at the edge of the small town, where the cracked pavement ended and the wild grass began to creep toward the road. The building stood on the boundary of the old cemetery, a place where the gravestones leaned at uneasy angles and the inscriptions were worn away by decades of wind and rain. Beyond the headstones, a dense pine forest arose, its needles whispering in a constant low hiss that seemed to deepen after sunset. The house itself was narrow, its walls faded to the color of bone, with peeling paint that curled like dead bark. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, and one of the shutters hung loose, trembling in the slightest breeze. During the day, its windows were sealed behind heavy curtains that never shifted, not even when the wind rattled the frames. From the street, the glass reflected only a dull, lifeless gray, as if the house had no interior at all. The yard surrounding it was a patch of dry, hardened soil without a single blade of grass. No flowers bloomed there, no weeds dared to grow, and in the center was a solitary stone bird bath filled not with water, but with brittle leaves and a layer of dark dust. Strangers walking past rarely lingered. Something in the stillness discouraged it. That's how it was with evil houses, too. The townspeople rarely saw her, and when they did, it was almost always in the hours before dawn or just after nightfall. She walked with a calm, unhurried step, her head slightly lowered, her gaze fixed ahead. Her figure, lean and pale, seemed almost to dissolve into the mist that sometimes rolled in from the forest. No one could recall ever seeing her carrying groceries, yet the house never showed signs of neglect inside, at least from the few who had glimpsed it long ago. In the corner of the living room stood a writing desk made of dark wood, its surface scarred by decades of use. On it lay a thick, leather-bound notebook, always closed, its cover a deep, matte black. She was often seen seated at the desk through the thin gap in the curtains at night, her head bowed as she wrote in long, deliberate strokes, pausing only to dip her pen into an old glass inkwell. No one knew what she wrote, but she filled the pages slowly, as though the act itself was as important as the words. On rare occasions, a faint metallic smell drifted from the house, carried by the wind across the cemetery and into the town. Those who noticed it described it as sharp and cold, like iron left in the rain. It never lasted long, and it was gone before anyone could pinpoint its source. Despite the air of isolation, the property itself seemed well maintained. The shutters, though weathered, never fell into complete disrepair, and the steps to the front porch, though creaking underfoot, had been reinforced with new wood at some point. It was as if she tended to the place in ways that mattered only to her, caring little for appearances as long as the structure endured. The cemetery behind the house served as a kind of backdrop to her life. In the evenings, when the sun sank low and the forest shadow stretched across the gravestones, a narrow path wound between the markers and toward the trees. Some swore they had seen her walking there at dusk. her figure passing silently among the graves before disappearing into the deeper dark of the pines. When asked about it, the few who admitted to seeing her offered no theories, only a quiet shake of the head. No one knew where she had come from originally. Some said she had been born in the town and had simply returned after many years away. Others insisted she was a stranger entirely, someone who had arrived suddenly, bringing the old house back to life after it had sat empty for decades. What was certain was that she had no family in the area, or at least none that anyone had ever met. Her presence carried with it a stillness that unsettled those who noticed it. It was not hostility, nor even secrecy in the ordinary sense, but rather a quiet that seemed deliberate, as if she were waiting for something. And though her life appeared uneventful from the outside, there were moments, small, fleeting moments, when the air around the house felt heavier, as if it held a memory that refused to fade. Even the way the light touched the house seemed different. In the early morning, the sun's rays caught on the upper windows in a way that left the lower floors in shadow, the line between light and dark cutting the facade neatly in two. It was a strange, precise effect, one that persisted no matter the season. People noticed it in passing but rarely spoke of it, perhaps fearing that naming it might make it linger in their thoughts longer than they wished. She lived quietly, without incident, yet the weight of the house's history, and her own, hung invisibly over her, shaping the way she moved, the way she kept to herself, and the way the town seemed to accept her presence without ever truly knowing her.
After her father's death, subtle changes began to bleed into her quiet existence. At first they were barely noticeable, slight alterations to her routine that could have been dismissed as grief's influence. But they grew. She began to vanish during the night, leaving the house when the streets were empty and the air held the cold stillness that comes before dawn. No one saw where she went, but she always returned in the earliest hours, her boots caked with damp earth, the leather darkened by moisture. Sometimes there were streaks of mud up the hem of her skirt, and the scent that clung to her was not just of wet soil, but of old, stagnant water, heavy with the smell of decay that lingered in basements or marshes untouched for years. Inside her home, new objects began to appear. They were not decorative nor practical in the ordinary sense. Stacks of books emerged, their cracked spines marked with Latin titles too worn to read at a glance. Between their pages, brittle sprigs of dried plants were pressed flat, their shapes fragile as ash. The herbs were unfamiliar to most, their colors muted, their scents faint but sharp enough to sting the back of the throat when the pages were disturbed. She placed these books not on her shelves, but in deliberate arrangements on tables, on the floor near her writing desk, sometimes left open as though she had paused mid-study. In the yard, subtle rearrangements took place. At first, it was a scattering of stones in seemingly random clusters. Later, these became intentional forms, shapes that curved and intersected in ways that drew the eye but resisted clear interpretation. The largest of these formations appeared one morning beneath her bedroom window, a wide circle of pale stones intersected by straight lines of darker rock. The geometry of it was precise enough to suggest planning, yet uneven in places, as if assembled in haste. The neighbors noticed, but said nothing. One night in early autumn, the clouds cleared after days of rain, and the moon hung low and bright above the town. That was when she was seen, standing in the middle of the empty street, her head tilted back, her eyes fixed on the pale light above. Her lips moved, shaping words without sound, the faint rhythm of her breath visible in the chill air. She stayed like that for a long time, motionless except for the silent forming of syllables, before turning abruptly and vanishing into the darkness between houses. The next morning, a dead crow was found on a nearby porch, its eyes gone, the feathers around its head ruffled and darkened as though from some rough handling. Other changes followed, less visible but more deeply felt. On certain nights, the air around the house seemed to hold a low vibration, an almost imperceptible hum that prickled against the skin. Some described it as a heaviness, as if the atmosphere itself had thickened, slowing the breath and dimming the light from the street lamps. From beneath the house, sounds began to emerge. At first they were faint, barely audible clicks or a single dull knock, the kind of noises one might attribute to pipes settling or wood contracting in the cool night air. But over time, the noises became rhythmic, almost deliberate. It was a slow, metallic tapping, with the measured consistency of someone striking a hollow surface with a spoon. The pattern repeated in long intervals, pausing as if to listen, then beginning again. Those who lived closest swore they had heard it, but none approached to confirm it. On windy nights, the smell that drifted from her property was sharper, more distinct than before. It carried the mineral tang of iron, layered with the faint rot of something organic left to steep in darkness. It was not overpowering, but it clung to memory, returning in flashes even days later. Her comings and goings became more erratic. Some weeks she was gone nearly every night, returning with her shoulders stiff and her eyes shadowed, moving straight to the basement door before emerging hours later. The locked door seemed more prominent now, its metal fittings freshly polished against the old wood, as though she had taken new care in securing it. The key around her neck was never removed. Occasionally, faint light was seen seeping through the thin seam between the basement door and the floor. An uneven glow, warmer than candlelight, but flickering in strange, irregular pulses. The light was never visible for long, and by morning the basement was as silent and dark as it had always been. She spoke to no one about these changes. The few who might have asked found themselves hesitating, as if the questions would not pass their lips once they stood near her. And in that silence, the strangeness settled deeper, rooting itself into the fabric of her days, until it was impossible to tell when the ordinary had ended and something else entirely had begun. The discovery came late in the season, when the air had begun to carry the faint bite of approaching winter. She had gone to the basement with no clear purpose, driven more by an unshakable restlessness than intent. The air below was as it always had been, cool, dry, and heavy with the scent of wood and dust. Against the far wall stood the old chest that had belonged to her father. Its surface was scuffed and dull, the wood darkened by age, the hinges blackened with rust. The lock, however, gleamed faintly, its brass polished to a strange, almost deliberate shine, as though someone had tended to it recently. She had never opened it before. The key that hung from the chain around her neck slid into the lock with an ease that made her pause. The mechanism turned without resistance, and the lid lifted on its own weight, creaking softly as it revealed the contents inside. There were only a few objects: a folded length of cloth, a tarnished silver pendant shaped like an incomplete circle, and a single envelope sealed in red wax. The envelope was thick, the paper stiff and rough beneath her fingers. Across the seam, the wax bore an impression, an unfamiliar symbol of intersecting lines and small dots arranged in a pattern that suggested deliberate meaning. The surface was marred by dark, uneven stains, some faded to the color of rust, others still deep brown, as if the paper had absorbed something long ago and refused to release it. She broke the seal slowly, the brittle wax cracking under the pressure, and unfolded the pages within. The handwriting was her father's, unmistakable in its long, precise strokes. The first line was written larger than the rest, the ink slightly smeared as if it had been written in haste. It told her that if she was reading these words, it meant they were near. It told her her son was alive. He had hidden the boy, but not for long. The letter spoke of people who would come for him, people tied to a lineage that stretched back further than she could imagine. It warned her not to trust the names she thought she knew, and not to seek help from those who had once been part of the family. A single page at the back contained an address for an adoption agency, along with a note that said the name was only a mask. The tone of the letter grew more fragmented toward the end, the sentences shorter, the handwriting less steady. There were marks where the pen had pressed too hard, tearing the paper in places, and a final unfinished line that ended mid-word. The following day she traveled to the address. The building stood alone at the far end of a street that looked abandoned even in daylight. Its windows were boarded, and the double front doors hung crookedly, one missing entirely. The paint on the facade had peeled away in large strips, revealing warped wooden planks beneath. The street itself was silent except for the faint rattle of loose signs swaying in the wind. Inside, the floor was warped and littered with fragments of plaster and glass. Dust coated every surface, and the air was thick with the stale scent of long-forgotten rooms. No furniture remained, only the outline of where it had once stood, faded patches on the walls marking the absence of cabinets or shelves. There was no sign of recent use, but as she walked through the narrow corridors, she noticed that certain areas of the floor were clear of dust, as though disturbed in the recent past. The tracks were faint and led to a locked door at the back of the building, but the rusted handle gave way easily under pressure, revealing only an empty, windowless room. Whatever had been there was gone. That week, a short article appeared in the local paper dismissing rumors of a fraudulent adoption agency. The police stated there was no evidence of its operation, past or present. Locals were quoted saying the building had been vacant for more than 20 years, though a few admitted in lower tones that they had seen people entering it late at night. She left with nothing tangible, but the words in the letter remained fixed in her mind, each one carrying the weight of both warning and command. In the days that followed, she began to search elsewhere, following threads of information that led her into quiet conversations with people reluctant to speak. Some claimed not to know anything. Others spoke only in fragments, hinting at a network that extended beyond the town's borders. The trail was inconsistent, but it moved steadily outward, pulling her farther from familiar ground. The search consumed the weeks that followed. She traveled to smaller towns where the roads narrowed and the houses sat far apart, where the locals glanced at her with wary recognition before closing their doors. The details she gathered were small: a description of a boy with pale eyes seen on the edge of a field, the name of a man who once worked for an unnamed organization, a reference to an isolated property in a rural county. None of it formed a complete picture, but the shape of it was beginning to emerge, a pattern like the stones she had once seen laid out in her yard. One lead drew her deeper into the countryside, far beyond the routes she usually traveled. The road narrowed to a single lane, bordered by hedges and ditches, twisting past fields gone brown with the season's decline. The sky hung low, pressing against the horizon, the air damp and heavy with the smell of wet earth. She drove without stopping, guided by a map drawn in rough pencil on the back of an old receipt. By the time she reached the end of the road, the light had thinned to a dull, colorless gray. Before her stood a farmhouse set back from the road, its silhouette barely visible behind a line of bare trees. The structure was large but unkempt, the siding weathered, the roof patched in places with sheets of mismatched metal. A single light glowed faintly in an upstairs window, its weak beam barely cutting through the dimness. There were no sounds from within, no movement at the windows, yet the air carried the distinct sensation of being observed. She stood for a long time at the edge of the property, the weight of the letter heavy in her pocket, before taking the first step toward the house.
The house accepted her presence without protest, its silence thick and unbroken, carrying a faint scent of melted wax and something older beneath it, like dust trapped for decades. The light inside was dim, filtered through curtains that let in only a muted glow, so that the air seemed to hold a constant dusk. She stepped across the threshold and felt the wooden floor shift faintly under her weight, as if remembering her from long ago. Just beyond the doorway stood Catherine. Her face was the same shape she remembered from childhood, but the years had drained its color to an ashen pallor. The eyes were clouded, not blind, but unfocused in a way that made it unclear whether she truly saw the person before her. Each movement she made was deliberate yet slow, as though her limbs obeyed a rhythm separate from her thoughts. Her breath moved her shoulders in shallow, steady lifts, and her hands hung loosely at her sides, fingers twitching slightly with each beat of some unseen pulse. She did not speak, nor step aside. She simply turned with measured precision, leading the way deeper into the house. The hallway opened into a sitting room lit only by the wavering glow of candles. Their flames bent slightly in the air as if disturbed by faint currents, though the windows were shut tight. Between the candles stood old religious icons, some painted, others carved in dark wood, their surfaces worn by the touch of many hands. In the center of the room, seated in a heavy chair with his back unnaturally straight, was her grandfather. His face was drawn in lines that had deepened with age, but carried a stillness that made it seem carved rather than living. His eyes found hers immediately, fixing on her with the weight of unspoken recognition. When he spoke, his voice was low, each word pressed into the air with the certainty of something that could not be unsaid. The tone carried no warmth and no anger, only inevitability. As he spoke, she felt the sound not just in her ears, but in the pit of her chest, like the resonance of a struck bell. The words outlined the shape of a prophecy, one older than the house, older than any of them. It told of a boy, born with the rare and dangerous gift to quiet the forces commanded by the daughters of the abyss. His existence was not an accident, but an axis on which the future turned. He was here already, in the next room, waiting. The candles seemed to sway when his voice faded, as though the room itself exhaled. Catherine remained still, her gaze fixed somewhere just beyond the grandfather's chair. The air thickened with the weight of what had been said, the meaning settling into her bones in a way that could not be undone. From the corner of her eye, she caught the faint shift of shadow at a half-closed doorway across the room. She moved toward it slowly, each step deliberate, until her hand found the edge of the frame. Inside, the space was smaller than she expected, its single window covered in fabric so dark that it absorbed what little light there was. A narrow bed stood against the far wall, and on it sat the boy. He was younger than she had imagined, perhaps no more than 8 or 9, with pale skin and hair the color of unpolished metal. His posture was unnaturally still, his hands folded loosely in his lap, his head tilted just enough to catch her in his gaze the moment she entered. His eyes, light and sharp, seemed to look past her surface, as though he were measuring something within. There was no fear in him, only an unreadable patience, as though he had been expecting her arrival for a very long time. The sensation came before she understood it, a sudden loosening, as if a cord had been cut somewhere deep inside her. The quiet power she had carried for as long as she could remember, the undercurrent that had always been there whether she willed it or not, was simply gone. In its place was absence, a hollow space that felt too vast for her own body. It was not taken violently, but it was total, and she knew in an instant it would not return while he remained near. His gaze held hers without blinking, his expression unreadable but intent. There was a curiosity in it, though not the kind that sought understanding. It was colder, analytical, like someone examining a specimen under glass. She felt the urge to speak, but knew instinctively that words would have no place here, that whatever passed between them was beyond the shape of language. The air in the small room felt different from the rest of the house, denser, as though the walls themselves leaned inward. Somewhere in that density was the unshakable sense that this meeting was not a beginning, but the point where something long in motion had finally reached its intended shape. The prophecy was no longer an idea carried in whispered words and sealed letters. It was a presence, sitting on the bed with his pale hands resting in his lap, watching her with the eyes of someone who knew more than she would ever be told.
The air in the room shifted the moment the ritual began, as if the walls themselves had leaned inward to witness it. The candlelight trembled, elongating shadows along the floor and ceiling, and the scent of melting wax thickened until breathing felt heavier. Catherine stood near the altar, the knife clutched in her hands with an unyielding grip. Her posture was rigid, but her face strangely serene, the muscles slack except for the faint pull at the corners of her mouth. The blade caught the flicker of the flames, its metal reflecting brief, sharp flashes like the blink of an animal's eye in darkness. The grandfather's voice rose over the muted crackle of the wicks, speaking words that did not belong to any living tongue she knew. The syllables were long and uneven, some pulled until they dissolved into a low hum, others struck like blows. His breath came in slow, deliberate intervals, and between phrases the silence felt almost living, as though it too had weight and intention. Lucia remained in the farthest corner, her small frame drawn in tight against the wall. Her hands pressed flat against the boards behind her, nails scraping faintly with each tremor that passed through her body. She stared at the floor, her lips moving soundlessly, perhaps in prayer, perhaps in repetition of something only she could hear. The ritual's rhythm was precise, almost mechanical. The grandfather's hands moved in circles over the altar, tracing symbols with powdered ash, each motion ending at the edge of the knife in Catherine's grasp. The smell of dried herbs and something metallic spread through the air, mingling with the wax and the faint odor of old fabric. The flames swayed together as though guided by a single draft that had no source. In those moments, time seemed to stretch thin. Every motion, every sound registered with unnatural clarity. The scrape of a shoe against the wooden floor, the hiss of wax spilling onto cloth, the slight rasp of Catherine's breath. Her eyes lifted only once, and in them there was neither fear nor defiance, but an odd stillness, as if she had already accepted the outcome long before the first word of the ritual had been spoken. Then, in a motion too swift to belong to the room's slow gravity, the knife left Catherine's control. The sound of it cutting air was brief, followed by the dull, wet impact of steel meeting flesh. A tremor passed through her body, and her knees folded beneath her with surprising grace. The expression on her face did not collapse into pain. Instead, it held that same strange serenity, shaped now into what could almost be mistaken for relief. The grandfather's voice faltered for the first time, catching mid-phrase, and the silence that replaced it was jagged and brittle. The knife remained warm in Elle's hands. Her breath was shallow, her grip unshaken, though her heart beat with the erratic force of something trying to escape confinement. The grandfather's sudden cry tore through the room, breaking the moment open. His tone was no longer ritualistic, but raw, filled with something older than grief and sharper than rage. He moved toward her, the folds of his robe brushing against the altar's edge, sending one of the taller candles toppling sideways. Wax spilled onto the altar cloth, and the fabric caught instantly, the small orange spark racing across its surface in a line that became a bloom of flame. The fire spread with unnatural speed, leaping from candle to candle as if guided by intent. Shadows recoiled from the sudden brightness, crowding the edges of the room. The air filled with the hiss of burning wax and the sharp, dry crackle of fabric surrendering to heat. The grandfather's shouts tangled with the noise of the fire, his figure now distorted by the shifting light. Lucia bolted from her corner, her movements no longer frozen by fear, but driven by instinct. Elle seized the boy's wrist, his skin cold despite the rising temperature around them, and pulled him toward the hallway. Lucia followed, her footsteps quick and light, barely audible beneath the roar of the growing blaze. The flames chased them down the corridor, licking at the walls, turning the air into something too hot to breathe. The smell of scorched wood rose sharply, mingling with the acrid bite of burning wax. The house's bones groaned as if in protest, each board underfoot straining under the heat's assault. When the front door finally gave way beneath Elle's pull, the night air rushed at them with a force that felt almost violent after the stifling enclosure inside. The cold struck their lungs, making their breaths visible in pale, fleeting clouds. Behind them, the house's windows flared bright, each frame a square of searing light against the dark. The fire moved with hunger, devouring the structure, as though it had been waiting for this moment. They ran, without looking back at first, their feet finding uneven ground in the yard, then the dirt path that led toward the tree line. Only when the trees began to swallow them in shadow did Elle glance over her shoulder. The house was a living torch now, its roof already collapsing inward, sending a cascade of sparks into the black sky. The noise of it was immense, a roaring that drowned the night's stillness, a voice too large to belong to the building alone. Somewhere in the distance, a faint ringing began. Whether from the fire's heat or from the edges of her own mind, she could not tell. She kept moving, the boy beside her silent and watchful, Lucia just behind, her breathing uneven. The fire consumed the house, and with it the altar, the symbols, the pages, and every other trace of what had taken place inside. Whatever the prophecy had begun, whatever it demanded, the physical evidence of it was turning to smoke and ash that the wind carried away into the unseen reaches of the night. The days that followed blurred into a slow and constant movement, each morning beginning in a different place than the one before. The road felt endless, stretching through landscapes that seemed deliberately empty, fields without fences, gas stations with their windows boarded, motels with peeling paint and numbers missing from their doors. Elle drove without speaking, her eyes fixed on the lines of the highway, as if the road itself might provide an answer she could not find anywhere else. The boy sat in the back seat, his head turned toward the glass, watching the scenery pass with a patience too still for his age. Lucia occupied the space beside him, silent, her gaze shifting between the road ahead and the shadowed shapes of buildings they passed. Nights were the hardest. Sleep came slowly and broke often, replaced by stretches of stillness in which she would watch the boy stand by the window. He rarely moved, his posture steady, his attention fixed on the darkness outside, as if there were something in it only he could see. In the dim light, his reflection merged with the night, his features half claimed by the glass. Sometimes his lips parted slightly, not in speech, but in an absent gesture, as though listening for a voice carried too far to be heard. Elle wrote in her journal without rereading her words, the ink carrying thoughts she did not want to speak aloud. Eli stands at the window and looks into the dark. Sometimes I think he hears them. Sometimes I think he remembers what he should not remember. There were moments when she wondered whether the cult's goal had ever been to destroy the Daughters of the Abyss. Destruction felt too simple, too final for a group that thrived on control. What they sought was to take the blood of the daughters, to bind it into their own power. It was not eradication they wanted, it was assimilation. A merging of what should never have been joined, the transformation of something ancient into a weapon that could be wielded by human hands. The ritual had been one attempt among many, a fragment of a plan that extended far beyond the walls of the burning house.
The air in these new places felt no different from the air they had left behind. The same restless wind, the same hollow spaces between buildings, the same sky that seemed to watch without judgment. People passed them without noticing, but Elle's eyes caught the way some turned slightly to look back, the way certain faces vanished into side streets without a sound. The absence of overt threat was not comfort. It was the quiet before something unseen moved closer. On certain nights, the wind would still, leaving the air heavy and unmoving. Those were the nights when it began, the faint, almost imperceptible sound. It came from far away, as though carried from a place that existed beyond the reach of distance. A soft, rhythmic tapping, each beat spaced evenly, without urgency, but without pause. It was not loud enough to be certain of, not persistent enough to chase, yet impossible to ignore once heard. The first time it reached her, Elle froze, her breath shallow, the sound slipping into her ears as if it had been waiting for silence to find her.
The boy would turn his head toward the sound, though it was too faint for anyone to be sure of its direction. His eyes would remain fixed on the dark beyond the window, unblinking, as though the tapping formed a pattern only he understood. Lucia would press her hands over her ears, not in fear of the volume, but as if to shut out the meaning behind it. For Elle, it was a sound she had known before, the same slow, deliberate knocks that had echoed through the floorboards of the house on the edge of town, the ones that had carried through the soil from the basement where no one dared to go. Each time the tapping came, it lasted only a short while before fading into the stillness, leaving behind an absence that felt heavier than the sound itself. She never tried to explain it to anyone, not even to herself. There were truths that could not be carried in words, and some patterns, once recognized, could never be forgotten. The road ahead was long, but in her mind it no longer led away from what had happened. It wound in a slow, unbroken circle, always turning back toward the same unseen center, where the sound would be waiting for them again.